When we talk about motivation, the first important thing we have to do is to pay attention to our semantics, because the word motivation, like all words that deal with human behavior, has a lot of different meanings. And one reason why there is so much misunderstanding and confusion about the issue is that people frequently have different things in mind when they're using the same word. So for our purposes, for the balance of this film, let's put one particular construction on the word motivation. We're going to use it to mean any action or event which has the effect of changing another person's behavior, something which results in another person acting in a different way than they otherwise might have. Now, most behavioral scientists, I think, could accept that definition. You will find later on that one particular behavioral scientist, Frederick Herzberg, uses the term in a somewhat different way, and when we get to a consideration of his ideas, we'll deal with his specific definition. But for the balance of this introduction, let's consider the term motivation to mean something which changes another person's behavior. Well, the first question, of course, is why should managers be concerned about changing other people's behavior? And the reason is that certain kinds of behavior can add to cost or add to profit. We can consider one class of behavior, for example, which people are perfectly capable of, which has the effect of making our operations more costly, what we might call costly behavior. For example, the most obvious example of costly behavior is an individual being physically absent from his workplace. If he's not there, he can't produce. Whether he's being paid or not, the actual productivity of his organization is decreased that day. Similarly, when people are careless or uncooperative, don't pay attention to their work, the effect is to increase the cost of producing the product or service. If he's discourteous to people, it reduces the market for the company's products. If he deliberately restricts output, that increases costs. And of course, more dramatically, if he engages in a strike or in sabotage, or if he decides to leave the organization altogether, the effect of this kind of behavior is to increase cost. Now, actually, all behavior is motivated, including these negative forms of behavior. So the problem that management faces is to find a means of minimizing or decreasing these costly forms of behavior. At the same time, there's another class of behavior that we have to be concerned with. This is sort of the opposite side of the coin. These would be actions which people can engage in which are valuable, which have the effect of increasing the value of the product or service being rendered. And the most obvious example of this is ingenuity, when the individual uses a little bit of common sense or a little bit of good judgment or even creativity to get the job done better as a result of his own wisdom right on the scene. Or the individual can sustain a high degree of effort for a long period of time, longer than he ordinarily would. Or he can acquire new competence as a result of experience and training and therefore become a more valuable employee. He can cooperate with his fellow workers and with management. He can make his ideas and the information he has clear to the other people in the organization who need to have it, rather than withhold it or be secretive. And above all, he can take a broad view of his responsibility, recognizing that he has to contribute to the overall excellence of the product or service rather than one little narrowly defined aspect of it. So from a managerial standpoint, the motivational strategy is fairly obvious. We want to do things which increase the likelihood that people will engage in this form of behavior and decrease their tendency to engage in costly forms of behavior. Well, the next question that arises is how do you do it? And to be perfectly candid, there are a number of different schools of thought on this issue, and in this film I'm going to speak to you really only from the standpoint of one school of thought. I guess I've made up my mind and thrown my lot with one approach, and that is the behavioral science approach, the sort of strategy which is based upon repeatable measurements, upon the kind of evidence which can be redemonstrated if necessary. Volumes, of course, have been written about behavioral research in this area, and I think the best summary, the best single one-sentence summary of the implication of behavioral science for management that I've ever come across is a statement that appears in a book by Douglas McGregor, which is called The Human Side of Enterprise. And this is what McGregor had to say. He said we can improve our ability to control, meaning influence human behavior, really. We can improve our ability to control only if we recognize that control consists in selective adaptation to human nature, rather than in attempting to make human nature conform to our wishes. What McGregor was telling us here was that all of the weight of research evidence indicates that you cannot make people different than what they are. It is beyond our power to really alter an individual's makeup so that he is more convenient to manage. All that we can really hope to do, if we're realistic about our notions of changing behavior, is to try to discover the forces to which people are responsive anyway, because they're built that way, because they're tuned in, as it were, on a particular frequency. And then select from among those forces the ones that we happen to be in a position to influence, so that the individual's actual experience changes. And then, by responding normally, naturally to that changed experience, his behavior will change, hopefully in ways that make him a more constructive member of the organization. This is, in fact, a fairly complex and profound thought. It may help for me to tell you about a little experience I had a while ago, which struck me at the time as being a rather close analogy to what McGregor had in mind, and also perhaps a little bit amusing. You'll no doubt recognize this as a map of the north-central part of the United States. And one day I found myself up here in Muskegon, Michigan, and I received a telephone call which required me to get down here to Cincinnati as rapidly as possible. It turned out that the only way to do this was to charter a private plane and fly directly, because the scheduled airlines weren't able to get me there in time. So this enabled me to realize one of my suppressed boyhood ambitions, you see, because I've always wanted to be a pilot, and at least I was entitled to sit in the co-pilot seat. I was the only paying passenger. The pilot was a very pleasant fellow, and he answered all of my various questions about the instrument panel, which interested me a great deal. At long last, I pointed to the only instrument in the panel which I recognized, which was the compass, and I read the bearing, the heading on the compass, and it was about 178 or 179 degrees. And I turned to the pilot and I said, well, that means that we're heading almost due south, just a point or two east of due south. And he said, that's right. The nose of the plane is pointing almost due south. And then I began to get a little bit concerned, you see, because Cincinnati is southeast, so to speak, of Muskegon. And if we continued on our present course, well, we'd probably come a lot closer to Indianapolis. And I checked this on a map to be certain. And now I was in an embarrassing fix, because I didn't want to tell the pilot how to do his job. On the other hand, it was important that I get to Cincinnati and not to Indianapolis. So at last I screwed up my courage, and I turned to him with a nervous little giggle, and I said, by the way, you know, of course, that I want to go to Cincinnati. And he said, yes, I know that. I also know, you see, that there's a wind blowing from the west, and the wind is going to influence the position of the airplane. The wind, if we continue our present heading, will have the effect of blowing us right over Cincinnati. If I headed the airplane directly to Cincinnati and ignored the influence of the wind, that same wind would blow us a lot closer to Pittsburgh. And sure enough, he was right, because a couple of hours later, we were in Cincinnati. Now, it seems to me that this pilot was doing his job in the manner which managers would like to do theirs. He was a sound, thoroughly competent professional, and what he was concerned with was controlling the position of his airplane, with arriving at the predetermined destination. But he recognized that there were certain forces that he was going to have to reckon with, because they would influence the position of his airplane, whether he was aware of them or not, whether he took them into account or not, whether he found them convenient or not. And he knew that there were limited options open to him. For example, he couldn't command the wind to stop blowing. He certainly couldn't command it to blow from a more convenient direction. But all he could really do was measure that force and use it. And you see, that's what we have to do in management, too. We have to determine the forces which are going to affect the behavior of the people in our organizations anyway. We have to measure them, select the ones we're in a position to influence, and use them. Now, probably the most widely accepted notion, theory, among behavioral scientists as to what the forces really are that influence human behavior has been summarized by a man named Abraham Maslow, a psychologist, and his theory can be expressed perhaps along these lines. Maslow says that, first of all, man is a wanting animal. Man's behavior is more or less governed by his needs, so that at any one time his behavior can be explained in terms of an attempt to satisfy a lack that he feels or something that he wants to have and doesn't have. Secondly, Maslow states that man's needs are arranged in a sort of a priority order, some of them being more important than others, some of them taking precedence over others in the event he has a need in that area. And the most fundamental need of all is simply the need to survive. These terms, by the way, are not Maslow's terms. This is just a restatement of them. But the fundamental set of needs are concerned with the need for sheer physical survival. So man needs to satisfy his hunger, his thirst. He needs to be protected from the elements. And whenever an individual is hungry enough, why, nothing else really matters, and he becomes completely preoccupied with the question of getting something to eat, for example, experience I suppose we've all had. But Maslow goes on to say, however, that when a particular set of needs are satisfied, man doesn't suddenly relax and become unmotivatable. Rather, another set of needs, which previously were only secondary, now surfaces and becomes the thing that disturbs him, and he is every bit as frustrated, every bit as determined to somehow satisfy this need as he was of the more fundamental needs. So the next thing that man becomes concerned with, if his survival is no longer in doubt, is to assure his access to the means of survival. And in modern industrial society, where survival is really a matter of having an income that you can use to purchase food and clothing and so forth, this gets translated into an assured income. So we have pressure for job security, pressure for guaranteed annual wages, and so forth. Again, however, when somehow or other, if we manage to satisfy these needs for security, Maslow says that man does not relax and become unmotivatable. He now becomes concerned with the comparison between the way in which he is treated and the way other people with whom he chooses to compare himself are treated. So he becomes concerned with the question of justice and equitability. And does my job receive a wage which recognizes its importance relative to that other fellow's job? And for example, we see a great many strikes or threats of strikes at the present time, which are not due to the fact that the workers in question are unable to afford a standard of living which is acceptable to them, but rather because they feel that their job is inequitably paid, unfairly compensated relative to some other group of workers that they choose to compare themselves with. And again, Maslow tells us that if somehow people can be satisfied that they've struck a fair bargain with the economy, once again, another set of needs surfaces, and this has to do with the degree of dignity they are accorded, the degree of pride, the degree of deference that they are accorded, whether they are treated with a proper degree of courtesy and esteem, or whether they feel somehow degraded and looked down upon. And lastly, and until recently, a need which we didn't know too much about and which may in fact be insatiable. In other words, it just may go on forever. And that's what Maslow calls self-actualization. Now, this is a point where the individual, with all these other more fundamental things provided for, becomes concerned with the question of am I going to have an opportunity in this life to really become all that I'm capable of becoming? Will my latent potentialities actually get a chance to blossom, so that if I have the underlying capacity, for example, to become an executive or to become a musician or a surgeon or a farmer or whatever it is that I could become, I will insist on becoming that. I'm going to strive to fully exploit my own talents and capacities. And that sounds like a rather esoteric sort of a need, and yet Maslow says that an individual at this level is every bit as frustrated by that need as the fellow down here who is worrying about whether he can get a potato to eat. And it's just as gnawing upon him, just as frustrating, just as capable of motivating him either toward productivity or toward mischief, either toward valuable or costly behavior. Now, another very important principle in the Maslow theory is that at any given time, an individual is primarily motivated by the desire to satisfy the highest order frustrated need he is currently feeling. Now, it's worth reflecting, I suppose, that throughout all of recorded history, and indeed in our own time for the majority of mankind, this has been the only set of motivators that have mattered. But in the last few hundred years in Western Europe and North America anyway, in the industrialized part of the world, there has been a gradual movement of larger and larger parts of the population up to these other motivational levels, so that we might assume today that in the United States, for example, probably most people are somewhere in this range, with security still important but becoming a less urgent consideration than it might have been a generation ago, and larger and larger chunks of the population, so to speak, becoming concerned with justice, fairness, equitability, dignity, and even with self-actualization. That would be particularly important with the young crop of highly educated people that is now beginning to enter the labor force. And everything that we see on the horizon indicates that in the immediate future, the motivational strategies which are going to be most effective in terms of actually affecting people's behavior are ones which are addressed to these higher order needs, rather than ones which are primarily addressed to helping the individual have something to eat or assuring him that he's not going to be out on the street looking for a job. Now, this brings us back, of course, to our opening question of what can management do to influence people in the direction of greater productivity. And apparently, from all the indications we have in behavioral science, what management has to do involves some changes in management itself. Because a lot of the procedures which we've been following for the purpose of motivation turn out to be relatively ineffective, perhaps even obsolete. It looks like we're going to have to be willing, on the basis of the evidence we have, to engage in some fairly bold experimentation. We're going to have to start tinkering in earnest with some of the ways in which we define the manager's job, some of the ways in which we design the job performed by every individual in the organization. We're even going to have to start tinkering with organization structure in itself. So I think that as we prepare now to consider in depth and in detail the findings of the leading behavioral scientists, we have to recognize that we're not embarking on a particularly comforting experience, but rather upon an adventure, one that is fraught perhaps with a certain amount of peril, but also, fortunately, from the standpoint of self-actualization, fraught with a considerable amount of challenge and opportunity for management.